That being said, all that being said,
Uh-huh.
for 99% of people, you don't need Premiere.
Right.
You don't need it. You don't need any Adobe programs, most likely. You probably don't even need any of the proprietary stuff at all. You can make do with the open source. And actually, make do isn't even quite the right word, because make do implies that you're having to forgo something or you're having to put up with it.
Right.
No, but in the open source space, they're perfectly adequate or even ideal for certain workflows. Adobe stuff, in a lot of cases, can be overkill.
Yep. Is overkill for most YouTubers, not even most just like people who want to just video edit casually. Like for most YouTubers doing it even full time, it's overkill. Well, hey there. Quick intro here. I just wanted to mention that I have done a very lengthy recorded kind of podcast episode discussing choosing a video editing platform and what's involved in that from people with more professional needs, and why he and I stick with Adobe software, even though we don't necessarily recommend that be what other people get into. And it's a fairly lengthy discussion, and there's a couple little tangents, and I've done what I can to edit this up and make it a little bit more quick-paced and consumable, but I do think it's a valuable discussion. This was recorded prior to my Linux video where I said I'm no longer trying to switch to Linux for video editing, and that whole debacle that has turned into a saga here. And this was recorded before that, but after the video where I gave my overall first impressions about DaVinci Resolve on Windows and whether or not I'd be switching to that. So I felt like this was a good time slot to have recorded, or to have released this, to kind of integrate, like I said, into this kind of saga. And if this is too long for you to watch in video form, the podcast episode will be uploaded in the description down below if you prefer to listen in audio form. That will be there if you desire. Hope you enjoy.
You've tried most of the open source ones, right?
Yes, although most of that was last year, but yes.
Kdenlive, OpenShot. What's the other one? Cinelerra.
I have not tried that one, at least in a few years. I think I tried that back in the like early 2000s.
I just looked up each of them to get like a first impression,
right?
And Cinelerra was the one I was like, oh, this is old.
Yeah, like that was
like,
what
I'm
was
pretty
recommended.
sure it's as old as I am.
Yeah, that was one of the first that was recommended, like when I first started getting into Ubuntu and things like that. And oh yeah, that looks oh.
Yeah, it's old.
It's XP Movie Maker days. Okay.
See, the only reason I know about it is because I was watching a video on digital audio by the Ziff guys, and at the end it says made entirely with free and open source software. I was like, oh, okay, so what did they use for editing? Oh, they use Cinelerra. Let me look at this. Oh crap, this is old.
It's time to talk about a topic that I sometimes avoid on the channel, believe it or not, despite the fact that people think that that's just all my channel is about: open source software, alternatives, and video editing programs. And we're going to talk about a lot here. I have Dillon, who is joining me, who has probably quite a bit more experience with open source software in general than I do, but a lot of discussion that I kind of get in a tenuous relationship with the Linux and open source community is with regards to the tools that I use myself for my work, which are mostly proprietary, and we'll touch on that in a minute. But I have used all the other alternatives, and I get a little frustrated with how recommendations are made, but I want to have a real solid discussion about choosing tools for your work, choosing a platform specifically to video edit on, and why it's not so simple as just switch to X, especially coming from a recommendation of someone who hasn't necessarily done what you're doing with X. Yeah.
Is that your intro?
That's my intro.
Okay.
Welcome.
So, hi. Hi, I'm Dillon, as he said. No, yeah, I have a decent experience with open source, particularly in the video space. Like, I've done a lot of things built around FFmpeg as to perform certain actions to speed up editing processes. I've also, when YouTube 360-degree video stuff I managed to make a pipeline for doing fully CG stuff using all open source tools. So open source video stuff is stuff I'm familiar with to an extent, not necessarily things like the non-linear editors, but I've briefly dabbled in some of them or had looked at them to see what the benefits are, and unfortunately I am still with Adobe.
He's the one who helped me with a lot of my FFmpeg scripts, and he wrote the PyWin context menu editor, things like that. So as far as I'm concerned, magic, but that's neither here nor there.
The Patreon ticker that I wrote when I was the day before my sister's wedding in a motel.
Yes, my in card. I forgot about that. Oh god. Yeah. He wrote the script to actually make my in card look as nice as it does, because I was ready to tear my hair out and he said, give me a little bit, and then popped this out and it was perfect, and I've been using it ever since.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep, I was in a motel the day before my sister's wedding.
A little nicer than it should be.
On a crappy laptop. Intel integrated graphics laptop.
Yeah. Do. Anyway, this video not sponsored by Intel. I and you use Adobe Suite for our tools, but I use other stuff, and I have used other stuff. In fact, I started video editing not with Adobe Suite at all. I actually started with, well, Windows Movie Maker to start, but I originally tried out...
Most people did.
Yeah. And then, as with most YouTubers of my generation of YouTubers, I then tried out the, at the time, Sony Vegas platform. And I actually spent a little gap time using open source tools. Now, unfortunately, because I didn't think they would do well for tutorials, there's not a whole lot of video tutorialing of me doing that, and I regret that a lot. But I actually tried out, I'm trying to remember which ones they were back then, but I was using earlier versions of Kdenlive, and this was 2012-ish, 2013. And maybe OpenShot back then. I was using a couple different ones depending on what I was doing, because back then I was making gameplay videos. It was an audio recording thrown onto gameplay clips. It wasn't anything too intense.
And if you're looking in the free space, things like Resolve, HitFilm, and Blender didn't exist. Well, Blender existed, but not doing any sort of video stuff.
I'd argue Blender still doesn't exist for doing video stuff, given the heavy amount of direct scripting I've seen you had to do just to import video clips. I'm just like, nope. Gonna press a stop button on that one.
I mean, like there's what's it called? AVI synth, which is the one where you have to write text files to do editing.
Yeah, people who do that kind of thing are masochists, and on a level, I can
understand it to an extent.
Like, there's needing ultimate control, and then there's just literally building every tool to do every action you do. You might as well just write your operating system in assembly or binary.
I mean, some people would consider that.
And they're probably the people who comment certain things on my videos, and that would explain a lot. But
for regular Joes,
right, there weren't a whole lot of tools back then. We have a lot of options now. Resolve is a big one if you're doing high level, like if you want to do higher end production work. Resolve has come a long way. Still has a long way to go. There are plenty of free options. There's there's like a whole list now in the OBS Discord. They have like a ton. There's Lightworks, which has a 720p 60 limit, OpenShot, Shotcut, Kdenlive.
Also some of the compositors can work as editors if you're a little bit masochistic. Like HitFilm has a free version, which is a perfectly adequate
That's true.
editor. I don't know if anyone would want to use it as one, though.
At the MCN I worked at, that was actually one of the most recommended editors was HitFilm, and I actually really appreciated the policy they had about it, because every time they released a new version, the old version would be wrapped up in a free package, which is a really cool way to go. And like, there'd be so many people praising Adobe if they released, say, CS6 for free. Now, they're not going to.
They did do CS2.
They did CS2 of Photoshop, and then they actually took that down. It's no longer available. It was only...
that's right.
It was up for like 4 years or something, and then for whatever reason, they stopped. I don't know why.
I think you could still get the installer, but you need to have the actual URL or FTP link. Because a lot of Adobe stuff is just... when they get rid of it, it just means getting rid of the links to
obscuring it.
Everything's still there.
I kind of prefer that to Microsoft's approach, where whenever they make a change, every link to every program or feature or whatever you go to just redirects back to the normal Windows 10 page. It's like, hey, go here to download DirectX. JK, it'll tell you to download Windows 10.
or it will redirect to a version you're not wanting.
Oh yeah.
This happened to me with Windows 10 installer. I had a Windows 7 laptop. This is a tangent. Windows 7 laptop which had a broken installation of Internet Explorer.
Uh-huh.
And it meant that the browser itself ran fine, but anything which depended on it
Oh god.
for internet connections
Right.
didn't work, which included a lot of games, so I couldn't play some online games. It included GitHub for Windows an age ago before Electron was a thing.
Right.
And it included every single Microsoft sign-on or sign-in thing ever.
Right.
And so it meant that in order I was like, okay, Windows 10 is here. I've got the free upgrade. I'm gonna get that. Every time I go to the link, it would always give me the online installer, and I'd be like, no, I want an ISO, damn it.
Right.
And I would click on all these URLs which says, here's where you get the ISO.
And they just redirect.
And then it would just redirect to say, here's the online installer.
Yep.
And the only way to get it to let me download the ISO was to go into Chrome and say, hey, I'm a phone now. I'm going to download this ISO to my phone.
So, despite what many people might believe, I've actually, as I mentioned, I've tried a lot of the open source and free video editing alternatives, which is a very important word for me, as my previous video, I think it was early 2017. It was a very reactionary video, so it wasn't very planned out very well. How many times am I going to say very? But I have tried out most of them, and I actually spent late last year trying out most of them. I said, okay, I have random side video for side channel here. Let me just edit it in Video Editor Y. And I filmed
I remember you mentioning that in your Discord.
Filmed my experiences. And pretty much all but one of them, I failed to make it like halfway through editing the video before I just rage quit. And that series has yet to come to light.
The one that you managed was Caden Live.
I think so. I think so. I think there was some.
Caden Live looks like a pretty solid editor, to be fair.
Yeah, and I mean they've had the most support and development, but I mean I run into issues like OpenShot and Shotcut are basically kind of like the more user-friendly versions of Cyberlink Power Director or Windows Movie Maker, where it's like assemble your clips real quick and you've got a video, but you don't have track control or actual customization. And then one of them, what was it? It was one of them I tried again recently that just refused to import WAV files or read audio or read video. It wouldn't read video from ProRes tracks or DNX tracks. I don't remember which one I was using. And then it wouldn't read audio from WAV files.
I'm trying to think. I have to actually look this up because I'm pretty sure those are even are they in the GPL version of FFmpeg?
I don't know if ProRes would be because it's got Sears licensing, but PCM WAV should be supported by everything.
Yeah, WAV should be everything.
And I don't remember which one it is. I have to go through and like make a list on screen for this video. But like,
I mean, actually, even if it wasn't, surely it should be GPL compatible because the other ones would have understood it.
And then the H.264 from my camera worked fine, but I had a few, like half of the files I wanted to import wouldn't work. And I just like, I was like, no, screw this. No, I need to, hang on. I should have looked. Yeah, it was Lightworks. Hang on. Lightworks was the best. I need to pull this up so I can reference it. I should have had this ready, but I will show this clip on screen. Let me skim around NPC. Yes, it was Lightworks that would not import any of my footage whatsoever other than a single like camera file. So no wave channel, no ProRes or DNX.
ProRes being from your Atomos.
Yeah, from my Atomos Ninja Inferno at the time. But it would read a H.264 file from my camera. Now, it could be some codec installation weirdness that happens with all video editors, but the fact that it worked in most other options and not this one, I got to, and I was like, all right, Lightworks is more proprietary. It's a paid platform primarily. It has the most development. Surely it would be the most compatible here, and it turned out to be the most frustrating because I just could not open formats whatsoever. And then I actually decided, okay, I'll edit a separate video using just camera footage just to try it out. And it split up the audio channels from the camera file weird. It wouldn't sync, like it had a sync audio feature like Premiere does, except it didn't work. It just like lined them up next to each other and was like, hey, you're good. It had all these just weird issues. on top of the fact that they have the weird 720p limitation for freeness, which, while I appreciate software that give free trials or free demo versions, I don't like handling it that way necessarily. And the rest were just too basic. Kdenlive, I think, I was trying these on Windows first, and then I was going to move to an actual Linux installation. And I think Kdenlive just kept crashing, like, no matter what I did. And the last I heard, even despite their most recent updates, like, half of their transitions are still 4x3. Unless you have things set up exactly right, it's still mostly, like, single-threaded. Like, certain things are multi-threaded, but not all of it. And
it's okay. It's not be... Like, to be fair to Kdenlive, because, like, again, I did briefly look at least all of the major ones. Kdenlive does look decently mature. Like, the first thing that stood out to me is like, oh, this has a proper effects rack with all the different types of things that you would expect in your basic editor. It's not necessarily a full compositing tool, but you don't need it as a full compositing tool. And so it's like, and then as just having the timeline be proper tracks, it looks like an editor. It looks like something if you know how an editor works, you can jump in and make use of it.
It looks a lot like Vegas or Resolve, just slightly, more open source characterized UI, but it looks really good. And those effects are GPU accelerated too, I believe.
And because it's open source has the benefit that if someone knows how to make something work good, someone is bound to make it work good. And like, it's not unprecedented in the video space, because FFmpeg, massive thing. OBS is full GPU accelerated preview area, and it even works with both DirectX and OpenGL. And so, and it's designed in such a way to be conforming to both of those across platforms and be identical. So in the open source space, it's like being able to make things work fast and make use of hardware is not something that's unprecedented. We've seen it before, and Kdenlive has that to some extent. But my understanding is a big part of the issues with it is like, is the encoding part at least multi-threaded? Because a lot of it seems to be bound single-threaded.
And I've noticed that, just as a side tangent, with a lot of things that rely on FFmpeg for their encoding, and I don't know why, because if I directly use FFmpeg command line, it pushes my processor like full tilt more than literally any program ever does. Like, that is my benchmark from now on. I never use like IDA64 or whatever Stretch says. I will encode a 4K 60 ProRes file with FFmpeg and watch it just melt my CPU. And if it survives that for like a 10-minute encode, then we're good.
I mean, to be fair, a lot of the applications are going to be using libx264 directly, and so FFmpeg wraps that and does some neat stuff under the hood to handle decoding and sending frames and buffering it all. It's not perfect, but it does a pretty dang good job of all of that.
And while I was, ones like OpenShot or Shotcut, they have so similar names. I get them so mixed up. Those kinds of editors are great for a lot of beginners, and I've always feared that YouTube tutorials, probably my own included, kind of shy people away from this, because especially as I mentioned with my generation starting out on YouTube, which was kind of the second wave of YouTubers, there were all these initial tutorials where the prosumers, the enthusiasts, first discovered like professional software. They're like, yeah man, just download Sony Vegas, it's the best, that's what you should use to edit your videos. And then people don't think the more basic editors are what they should be using anymore, when honestly, when it was still available, Movie Maker is what they should have been using, not Vegas. And ones like Shotcut, I mean,
technically you could still download it, but
well, not officially. They don't let you download the Live Essentials package anymore. But
Live Essentials.
but the ones like OpenShot and Shotcut that are more meant to assemble clips, like that would probably make so many beginner YouTubers' lives easier to start out with that instead of jumping in with like a multi-track interface with effects everywhere, and like that's too much. And so for a lot of people it would be fine, but my issue is always when people jump in, clearly don't understand my workflow or my needs, and say, oh, you should use this, and then I open this up and I'm like, I couldn't use this 5 years ago, I can't use it now. The more better I get at my job, the less I'll ever be able to use this. Yeah.
To be fair, there's a lot of workflow differences which are just going to necessarily happen with any program. That's
Absolutely.
Not an open source thing. It's not a pay. It's not something which is a free thing. It's a software thing. Everything has different workflows, and there are switching costs. There's also the opportunity cost of whatever editor you've switched from or whatever was the next best, whatever benefits that would give you, you're having to forego by switching. And so you're not going to be able to find something which is going to have everything you want unless you made it yourself.
Absolutely.
There's always going to be some feature that you as an individual want that the creators of the software do not consider to be important or are unable to provide the resources into implementing, because like they have their idea of here's what the core audience of the software needs, and this does not fit inside it. And if you reach a certain point where those are necessary for your job, you start running into problems. For instance, do any of the open source ones have any sort of multicam editing functionality?
I think Kdenlive might.
I'm thinking Cinelerra might.
I don't know.
But I couldn't find anything to do with it when I was looking it up for Kdenlive, what its multicam workflow was.
Right.
But there's been times where I've needed to use multicam, even if it wasn't necessarily a true multicam production, like if it was editing someone's Let's Play. Like even that, you can benefit from multicam just because you're having multiple recordings and you're wanting to record yourself switching between them, and so you have a pre-done timeline. Adobe Premiere Pro, that's easy. You set up your layers, you go into multicam editing, and you just click.
As long as you have enough memory and VRAM, because
yeah,
I can't use multicam in Adobe anymore because it just stops playing, or either it'll keep playing and lock me out of the UI and just keep playing, and I can't make cuts anymore, and thus it's totally useless. But that's besides the point.
You can always just do like very low res proxies.
Yeah. I just refuse to. But yeah,
that's your own fault. But even things which aren't core things like that, I consider multicam editing to be a core functionality that non-linear editors should have, or at least have a workflow to easily edit multiple cameras or multiple pieces of footage together. That's a non-linear editor thing. But a big issue that I have is integration with other software.
Right.
I don't want to make it seem like Adobe's perfect. Adobe isn't perfect. There's a lot of problems with it. But one of the big things which is important for what I do, particularly in Adobe stuff, is with dynamic link. Because here's a real workflow which I've had to do. I've had to take animations, Swift files from Animate, vector files from Illustrator, and Photoshop files from Photoshop, take them into After Effects, bring them back into Premiere, and do audio in Audition.
Yep.
And you can do that.
And that is the biggest reason, and it seems like a dead horse that I always beat, but that no one seems to listen to when they're basically demanding I switch platforms or that I can, is that is the reason that I stopped looking for alternatives, is there is literally nothing that exists that replaces all of that. I don't pay for just Premiere. I pay for Premiere, After Effects, Photoshop, Illustrator, Audition, Prelude, a bunch of stuff I don't actually use. But that back and forth, I use that daily. I don't do as much as you probably did in that situation, or most people could do with higher end workflows.
I was doing compositing and a final edit for a person's animation, and so that's why I was having to deal with Animate files from people.
Right.
So I was bringing those in, doing some editing in Animate just to make my life a little easier. Some background artists had done some stuff in Photoshop. There were some assets that were done as vectors, so I needed to bring those all together and make a final composition and be able to edit it to give a final mix.
Right.
Everything is staying entirely within the Adobe space because that's what everyone else is also using, and it all works nicely together. And you mentioned Prelude, whatever.
Yeah.
That is specifically an application which is designed to act as ingest for everything else in the chain.
Right.
You go from Prelude, you can do all your metadata, and you can do bare basic editing and then send that over to Premiere. From Premiere, you can send to Audition and After Effects when you need it, and then you can import all that other stuff.
Right.
Everything just is designed to go from start to end cleanly and without having to do a lot of waiting.
Yeah, it is literally it is the most literal example of a workflow versus a video editing program. And even my own daily videos, they are video files imported into Premiere, set up in sequences. Then I will bring in multiple different types of graphics, usually created on the fly from After Effects, dragged in with alpha channels, which a lot of the free editors don't necessarily support. Then I will have Photoshop graphics. I will right click, edit audio in Audition, edit it, save it there. It all links back. And then I render it out all in one place with varying degrees of stability. But it happens. And even if I were to have alternative tools for every single one of those steps, which After Effects, it's mostly not going to happen.
Fusion's nice.
It would take exponentially longer because either I'm saving out files, compressing, flattening, like GIMP edits, I guess, or Krita edits into PNGs, or with whatever After Effects alternative, I would have to render all of that out, import it. If there's something I have to change, like in the newer versions of Premiere, you can now edit After Effects text in Premiere. You don't have to go back to After Effects. You can rechange the text in the FX panel, and then it's there. And you don't have to re-render it in Audition. You have to, if you were just using Audacity or whatever, you have to save the audio out, export it, import it back in. Like, there's so many extra steps that would take 10 times longer, and it's not just relearning it. It is literally every single edit would take so much longer.
The thing is, this is a case where Adobe's workflow is clearly designed for that start to end thing in mind.
Right.
In the open source space, it is unfortunate because everyone's working on their own thing.
It's all isolated.
Like, well, not necessarily even just isolated, because you have crossover between people who are interested in both projects and are contributing to multiple projects. But more so, you can't necessarily make it so that this software can be designed specifically to work with this other one without essentially just merging teams or putting in a lot of work where someone will be like, okay, well, you're working with this software, but I use this software. Why don't you make it work with this? And then
Right.
So you start running into issues where people are asking for things which you can't physically put in the time to complete. On the flip side, there is the idea in open source or particularly Linux development, whereas like the Unix philosophy of do one thing and do it well.
Right.
And that's why you get all these different programs which specialize in their one specific task,
Right.
and can do those tasks sometimes a lot better than the proprietary solutions. And the part of that philosophy is also the idea that if you want to perform a lot of functionality, you're supposed to chain together programs to perform those actions in sequence or to pass information between each other. And in theory, that idea of passing information between each other, specializing in, I'm going to work on this program to do this specific thing. You could build an entire ecosystem out of that and fully in the open source space. You could essentially recreate dynamic link by just saying, okay, this, say Kden Live, for example, just have a track object, which is just pulling a live render output from whatever program it's connected to.
Right.
And whatever program it's connected to, it just sends back some RGB data. And so that would effectively recreate dynamic link. And that's entirely within the possibility for open source, but it doesn't exist.
Right. There has to be the need for it, but there also has to be kind of the catch-22 of there has to be the user base to demand it. Because I mean, there's the development time, but then there has to be the people using it. And I think I've even encountered certain instances where that kind of feature was developed between two programs. It was like a plugin that someone else contributed, but then it gets depreciated or outdated because it's not maintained.
Deprecated.
I always say the wrong word.
Everyone does.
Deprecated, or it's just...
I don't even know if that's the right way to say it, but depreciated is its own word.
Right.
So surely it can't.
That's fair. It doesn't work anymore, and the only other solution is then to use like an super older version of Program X, and then you're missing other features, and it's not always a great experience if it's not regularly maintained.
There is another thing, which is the benefit of, like in Linux shells, you have the idea of piping, where you take the output of one program and you send it to another program. And a benefit of that is that it's very efficient on memory, because when it's passing from program A to program B, that's shared memory. It's sending it from one to the other, and so there's no doubling up of memory.
Right.
But you have, in order to do that, you either need to have the programs know how to talk to each other so that they share memory, or you have to do that piping setup. And piping is one way. You can do some ways of doing named pipes to go back and forth, but then again, you need to make it so the programs know how to talk to each other.
Right.
Whereas Adobe, every program has a shared memory space.
Right.
like you could probably pull it up in the Premiere menu. You could see
Yeah.
that it has all the icons of all the programs which can share the same bit of memory, and you say, I want all the Adobe programs to use this amount of memory. And it'll even tell you, here's all the applications which are active. They'll also use all the same caches. So if you point Premiere
Right.
and Adobe to the same cache, it will not be redundantly stored. And individual programs, that's something individual programs can't do. How do they share caches? The only alternative is to read files directly off of disk and not make cache files. But you get benefits from cache files
Right.
for speeding up decoding.
That's a big issue I run into even with all other paid editors, is they're not designed for, like, okay, I was trying not to sound super sellouty for Adobe right now, but a big thing about Adobe's platform on the whole, and we can expand on this later, is it is designed to be as flexible as can be for literally any workflow, which includes my net workflow and workflow of most professional editing situations, I would imagine, including Linus Media Group and things like that, where I'm editing over the network. My footage is stored elsewhere, not on my machine, and I'm piping it in over the network. I'm not going to use piping since that was a separate definition here. Pulling it in over the network and editing it locally, which requires local stored cache so that whatever data it is recording to disk locally, it can pull much quicker than over the network off of an NVMe SSD, for example, which is what I use. Same thing for scratch disks are very useful for like Photoshop and GIMP and things like that. Many of the other, even paid editors, don't support like manually mapping where your cache and scratch disks go. So then it's trying to pull that back over the network. And even though I'm on a 10 gigabit network, it's that kind of random quick grabs really slows down. And so there are plenty of paid professional editors that I just can't use because I would have to copy terabytes of video files locally to then edit and then copy back. And it's just a mess.
Set up some sort of proxy workflow
Right.
where you store a low resolution copy and then do what's. I always forget the distinction between offline and online editing. There's specific terms in TV for
offline's from the proxies not having access to everything, and then online has access to everything. Yeah, which I could do, but that takes more time to generate those that I don't have to do in my current workflow.
And it's also a case that whole idea of offline online is, as I mentioned, is from TV, where you have the offline editor who does the bulk of like the story or editing for what they want to show for the show as part of a show.
Right.
And then you have the online editor whose job is purely just get all the footage, the real footage, collect all the visual effects from everyone and make it and edit it down for time or make it into a format which is good for everything. A lot of the time, though, we're doing stuff on our own, so we are both the offline and the online editor.
Right.
And so we need a workflow which can work for being able to do the bulk editing, cutting for time, cutting for a flow of the video, pacing, and then also be able to deliver something to YouTube or to a client or whatever we're doing.
Right. And
so we need to have a program which is flexible for both sorts of work.
And now they have a new program, which is actually even more flexible in that regard, which we'll talk about in just one moment, but I keep wanting to bring up a big issue that actually the open source community would be able to solve theoretically with a specific video editing program if I were to, request it or fund it, is a big thing keeping me from switching to anything. Final Cut, not that I have Macs to edit on, but Final Cut, Resolve, anything, is I'm at a point where I'm using, mostly written by Taryn from Linus Media Group, not my own code, but auto hotkey scripting to manually map a metric buttload of macros and shortcuts into Premiere. These are manually mapped using basically manipulating the mouse to do, because literally no video editor supports setting up keyboard shortcuts to do these things. I've looked into it. Resolve, Final Cut, Avid.
Well, without learning how to do coding or making scripts.
Without having to
you could feasibly do something with scripting in Adobe, or you could feasibly write plugins or scripts for other editors. But
true, natively. Okay,
then you
natively.
Learn JS or Python or one of those scripting languages.
Right, within the native control editing space, preferences of the software, you can't do it. Which is like this. I'm barely editing this auto hotkey code on my own in the first place, and so while theoretically I could transfer this to another program if I could remap all the cursor mapping and learn exactly what's needed for those programs, it's enough over my head that this is already like peak what I can do. And so that's something the open source community could solve, because theoretically it would not be that hard for the developer of Kdenlive to be like, yeah, you can set keyboard shortcuts for presets. Why not? Because there should be no reason. Like, that should be easy for them to create, but I would need other things in order to switch in the first place. But that would be the advantage of switching to open source, was I could theoretically request that, get enough backing, or just pay for it, I guess, and have them develop that for me.
A big benefit of the open source space is that basically everything is scriptable.
Mm-hmm.
Which is, like, that is something which Adobe has only to an extent. Like, in After Effects, we have expressions. We also have a plugin SDK. We also have scripts. So those are and then scripts can also work in Premiere and a lot of the other programs.
Right.
But it's a weird form of JavaScript. It's like a typed version of JavaScript, and its documentation is awful. Like, in order to write a script for After Effects, I had to pull up documentation for it from CS6.
Oh, nice.
And the editor, which Adobe ships for those scripts, is still labeled CS6.
That's great.
So you have to get Extend Script Toolkit CS6. Or actually, is it CS? No, it is. Okay, it's CC, but it doesn't have a year.
Oh, nice.
So it was the first CC, Extend Script Toolkit CC.
So 2014.
No... Yeah.
Actually, no, 2014 was the year, so it'd be like 2013. Oh, Lord. Anyway.
No, 2015. I thought 2015 was the first numbered CC.
So CC, okay.
Whatever.
It's been a while.
But that's the benefit that almost every open source thing has, is that almost every user program has a scripting interface. And the scripting interface, because it's written by the people who write the programs and it's documented by the same people, it's like, well, the people writing it know what everything does.
Right.
And so it's accurate most of the time. Not always. So you know it's accurate, and then that documentation usually exists in a tangible form. And if you do put in the time to learn the programming, you can make really interesting workflows that the developers never intended. And that's something which is much harder to do in the proprietary space, yet alone. Actually, yeah. Much harder to do in the proprietary space unless you've implemented something like that as part of the software, which usually isn't good.
And that's one of the appeals that makes a lot of people who are programmers or coders or know what they're doing to kind of wave that around in other people's faces. Oh, you can just mod it however you want. But a lot of the people doing real day-to-day professional work, and not even myself included, like I'm a YouTuber, there's kind of like a middle ground there, but like actual like artsy professionals, they're creative types, they're people, some of them barely know how to use computers outside of their editing program. Some of them are like me and know their way around computers and operating systems, but can't code. Like that's
some people long for the old days where they had actual VHS tape editors.
Some of them really do. Like,
I'd love to have one of those, actually. Genuinely.
I for all of my love of analog and retro tech, reel-to-reel or tape-to-tape editing just doesn't sound like an experience I want to add to my repertoire. I don't think I could do it. I actually had a SVHS deck that was kind of set up like that, and then a couple DV decks that I was struggling to get working, but was just trying to use for capture purposes, and I'm just like looking at it for editing. I'm just like, no, please, never. It might be fun if I had the patience, but I just don't have patience. But that's another thing, is my job is to edit the videos, or, you know, someone's job would be to create the graphics. Their job is not to program all of this extra stuff. And if we don't have that experience, that benefit, other than hiring someone or begging Dillon, for example, to develop little things for us to help us along the way, it's not accessible. It's not an option. I mean, it's there, but it's not, you can't actually do it.
It's not something you should rely on to be able to do everything. It's something which is, I'd argue, it's still a good skill that everyone in that space should try to have. Because expressions in After Effects have been like a godsend.
Well, yeah.
And being able to understand them, because it saves so much time. If you can write a script to automate something, or an expression to be able to do something complicated that you would otherwise have to do manually over a few hours, that's time that you're saving. But you shouldn't have to rely on that for everything.
Right.
Because the idea is it's augmenting or supplementing the tools that are already there.
Right.
you should be able to do something without the need for those scripts, but they help.
And I mean, if it's a time to value benefit, using tools that mostly do what you need to do already for you, and then you just have to slightly mod it versus having to heavily mod something to do what you need to do. You kind of got to pick the tool that's already doing half the job for you in a lot of cases.
An important part of that is also the plugin ecosystem. Like every red giant plugin ever.
Which also aren't available on Linux, and part of why I'm stuck not being able to switch to Linux, because that's the thing. It's like, okay, if they somehow rigged up Proton and some weird codec licensing to get Premiere up and running right now on Linux, I'd still be kind of stuck with like half of what I need not there. And
but also, there's also like the whole marketplaces around stuff, which is designed to work with Adobe software. And then you run into like the catch-22 situation of like, well, everyone's supplying things for Premiere or After Effects, and so people use Premiere
more
and After
enmeshed
Effects
in it.
use of that, and so there's more incentive to make stuff for Premiere and After Effects because there's more people. Self-fulfilling prophecy.
And this brings up a big thing that was a big topic of the last interview I was in regarding video editing on Linux that didn't go so hot, was that kind of thing. You just keep enmeshing yourself into the proprietary ecosystem, but at the same time, you don't necessarily have a choice. And that what comes up whenever people when I try to go toe-to-toe with people about this topic, is initial recommendation. Open source software X or open source in general can do everything you want. Why don't you switch? Okay, I need to do X, Y, and Z. I can't do that here. Is there an alternative? No, you can't do that. Why would you think you could do that? That's not possible. Just stop doing that thing. Like that's what I was told was I just don't need to edit the way that I edit, or to the degree that I edit, or in the resolution that I edit, and I need to just scale down my needs in order to use this ecosystem, or to stop learning these new things which will benefit me in my career. Even if I stop doing YouTube, I need to stop using these things or learning these things and just learn the open source things. And it's just
I mean, to some extent also, like, even if something can feasibly do the exact same things, obviously there's a switching cost in terms of you having to learn the new software, having to learn it. But if the result is better,
then it would be worth
it. Then that switch is a good thing to make, and it can mean short-term loss in productivity, but you can mean long-term.
Which I would be willing to do, just to be clear.
The issue, though, is something which already exists within individual programs, not even considering comparing programs, is different things within one program can result in completely different looks, even though they should be the same.
Mm-hmm.
Case in point, I can actually, I'll get these screenshots to you, actually. After Effects, the classic 3D renderer.
Oh, yeah, I forgot
the ray trace renderer, the Cinema 4D renderer that they added in the CC 2017, I think.
Yep.
Or 2016, one of those two. I have one After Effects scene which I use as my stream's Be Right Back screen. I made it myself fully in After Effects. It doesn't use any of the ray trace specific features, but I was using the ray trace renderer because, hey, GPU acceleration and complicated 3D stuff.
Right.
If you render it in the classic 3D renderer, it looks completely different to the ray trace renderer because it's doing different sorts of alpha blending. The depth of field is different. The way it interprets the camera settings is completely different. And that's not even accounting for the Cinema 4D renderer, which replaces the ray trace render. The ray trace renderer has been deprecated.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have depth of field. It doesn't have proper shadows. It has a lot of features which you can look on if you make a comp and you select as a renderer and says, this will not work. And there's a long list of things that will not work. And the ray trace renderer does not work on NVIDIA 10 series cards.
Of course not.
Any NVIDIA 10 series cards. It works on 9 series cards. It works on my old GPU, which was a 660. I've got a 1050 Ti now. It's not the best card, but it was an upgrade.
Right.
Although I can't ray trace anymore.
This is actually present in Premiere itself with scaling. If you have CUDA acceleration on, or any GPU accelerated plugin, which automatically triggers CUDA acceleration, which everyone should use because it's exponentially faster. If you use software only, you're a madman, or just using Final Cut 7 on a dual Xeon server from 2007. It changes the scaling. It's more inaccurate. There's actually, if you set something to like 200% scaling to go from 1080p to 4K, there's a like 2 pixel border around the video that you can see the underlying layer. Text scaling gets a little bit more artifacty. There's these little things where just a basic feature is different, even in Premiere
Isn't it
itself.
also the case that the text editor for the titles versus the new system, isn't it one which would always be like a slight gray, like a very slight gray, and then the new title it actually defaulted to proper white?
Yes.
Or was they both gray?
Something like that. I do remember that. It just, they had they acted differently, and yeah.
But the point I'm making there, though, is like that's within individual software. It's all the same settings within the one software, and yet you get completely different results based on just one change, and that is what is doing the rendering.
Right.
Take all those problems, and they become exponentially worse when you're dealing with other software which has a completely different set of settings and a completely different renderer. And now that's a very much mostly After Effects specific thing, because most of the time you're just doing basic editing or you're doing color correction. It's pretty hard to make that different between programs. A curves should be a curves, levels should be levels, should be. And masking should be masking. So in theory, like the basics should be all the same, but then when you get into the complicated stuff or the 3D stuff that I'm more involved in, then you start to... It becomes a lot harder to justify.
The same thing is...
switching cost gets exponentially worse.
Right. And the same thing's present even in like the photo editing space. Editing like camera raw files are complete interpretation in software of just raw RGB Bayard data. And so Adobe has multiple different profiles within Photoshop and Lightroom that you can interpret the raw file in and then result in a different look on one. And what is it? Is it Darkroom? No, Darktable, I think is the open source one I've been testing. Basically Lightroom alternative. They all interpret camera raw files differently. And so if you have specific...
Well, I think After Effects uses Photoshop's raw interpreter.
Right. But like between programs...
that should... Yeah, but because they share the same interpreter, if you bring something from Photoshop into After Effects or you import directly into After Effects, you would expect similar results there.
Right.
And because you can bring After Effects into Premiere, you could expect the results there.
Right.
It's pretty much... I think that's pretty much just Lightroom in the Adobe ecospace.
Right.
Ecosystem.
But if you are...
Ecospace.
But if you're a photographer looking to switch to alternatives, even going proprietary to proprietary from Lightroom to on one camera raw or to the open source Darktable, the looks you're getting, even the typical Canon look from cameras, is going to be interpreted somewhat differently, and you might have to make changes to make that happen, which is just a fundamental like characteristic of what you're working with.
And I'll play a little bit of devil's advocate here, because one can make the argument that there is that initial switching cost, but and once you've set it up once, you can do presets if the program supports it.
Right.
You can do presets and you can make up for the loss in productivity, because after that point, everything is just pick the preset or make these changes. You know how everything works. You've learned the differences between them. There is still going to be the case that if you're going into unfamiliar territory or you require the use of different tools for certain clients, like I remember didn't you have to do Cyberpower Director in Vegas for an Intel sponsored video because you couldn't show Premiere?
Yeah.
It's like that's a client which is requiring you to use specific software for a particular thing. There is going to be cases where you can't pick, and so it's going to be a case like, what is the software I'm most likely going to be asked to use, and how can I then put my time into learning everything about that?
Right. And that's
most people are going to ask you to use Adobe.
And that's extremely important for the professional space. Is in video editing, if you actually want to do that professionally, there's the holy trinity of Final Cut, Avid, and Premiere for actual timeline cutting. And while it will, the argument is totally valid that learning alternative tools, learning the open source alternatives, being able to offer that or use it when requested, can only benefit your career or just benefit, like, I suggest learning Linux because it helps you understand operating systems and computers better. Using alternative video editing tools can help you understand video editing tools better on the whole. When you only have limited time to learn and master specific programs, your priority needs to be on the options that you're going to get paid to use, not on the options that you might want to support on principle.
That being said, all that being said,
Uh-huh.
for 99% of people, you don't need Premiere.
Right.
You don't need it. You don't need any Adobe programs, most likely. You probably don't even need any of the proprietary stuff at all. You can make do with the open source. And actually, make do isn't even quite the right word, because make do implies that you're having to forgo something, or you're having to put up with it.
Right.
No, but in the open source space, they're perfectly adequate or even ideal for certain workflows. Adobe stuff, in a lot of cases, can be overkill.
Yep. Is overkill for most YouTubers, not even most just like people who want to just video edit casually. Like for most YouTubers doing it even full time, it's overkill.
But like, I need the overkill because I abuse it.
Right.
Because I write a crap ton of expressions to automate certain tasks. I deal with all these different software talking to each other. So for me, I need overkill. But that is because I'm dealing with sometimes with animation, sometimes I'm dealing with Let's Plays, and sometimes I'm dealing with just talking to a camera or review content where I need to pull in a whole lot of clips and a whole lot of stock images and be able to edit them together. That I need to be able to be completely flexible and need to have all those features there. If you're just doing like a vlog, for instance, or you're doing a particular setup that you can reproduce consistently, like a basic review is talk to the camera. You have your A-roll camera stuff, and you have your B-roll shots of the product, and you just need to put them into a timeline. If you don't need to do anything above that, like you particularly need to do
Right.
color grading. You're dealing with proprietary formats and like the RAW. You're dealing with the Ursa now.
Right.
How's the Ursa treating you?
Oh, it's amazing. It is amazing.
Yeah. So you're dealing with all of that. So you need to have like a flexibility to be like, okay, I need it to work with this. I need to be able to do the color stuff in the program I'm doing, and I occasionally need After Effects. And so for you need the Adobe space.
Right.
Most people aren't necessarily even going to touch After Effects if they get Premiere.
Right.
And even then, sometimes if they're getting Premiere, they're only paying for Premiere, so they don't have After Effects.
Right.
A lot of the time, people are not doing color work because being a colorist is an art.
Yep.
You need to have a good sense for how color acts. You need a good sense for how cameras work. And you need to have a good sense for how realistic lighting works. And so most people don't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole. And yet, people keep getting told, if you want to be treated seriously, you need to use Premiere.
Yep.
I hate that.
It's akin to, which is very common, the discussion about choosing a Blue Yeti microphone, for example. Yeah, people are burned by a lot of people using them poorly and waving around, hey, I have a $200 microphone, and it sounds like ass. But there are plenty of people who you'd never know that used a Blue Yeti microphone that sounded amazing because they knew what they were doing. And same people, I remember I started editing in Windows Movie Maker, and before I actually went back after I switched to higher end stuff, went back and used it again and was able to reproduce convincing results that you wouldn't really know I was using it if I hadn't told you. There's all the tutorials of the generations of YouTubers that grew up being told they needed to use this or that, or, you know, if you want to get started on YouTube, download your copy of Sony Vegas Pro 15 in the description below with this AdFly link, and you'll become a pro YouTuber in no time. And
I remember those. Sorry, for legal reasons, I can't claim that I remember those.
I have encountered them on the Wild West of YouTube of old.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so that's like the arguments, like you don't need Premiere. And so like a lot of people will say that, okay, then why do we still use Premiere? And like we've given all those reasons. But then another big one is cost.
Right.
And that's going to be a lot of the barrier to entry for people using the professional stuff is either cost or figuring out how to pirate it. And a lot of cases, paying for it is not something you should be doing because you don't need it. And piracy is you're pirating software. People like to have, food on their tables. Give them money for the software.
It's morally wrong, and you no longer own any copyright of anything you've ever made. So you're like, if you ever make a business out of this, your entire life could be shut down in a moment.
And so like cost is a big issue. And so it's like, well, why do we pay for Creative Cloud? And I'd argue that it's the wrong kind of question, because Creative Cloud in the long term is a fixed cost.
Right.
You pay a certain amount each month for a subscription to Creative Cloud, regardless of how many videos you end up actually making or how many projects you're involved in.
Right.
Yes, it might be 50. What is the US price for a Creative Cloud subscription?
50 something a month, I think.
Yeah. If you do 10 videos in a month, that means you've paid $5 per video.
Right.
If you're doing one video, then it's like, well, it's $50 per video. That's a bit much.
Yeah, that's a little steep.
And so, like, it is, the more you make use of it, the more that fixed cost gets spread and the more use you actually get out of it. And it makes more sense when you think about it in terms of dollars per video rather than dollars per month.
Right.
And what really adds up, what the real cost of video production is usually the variable costs. Because your content, for instance, is review content, and while you get samples, a lot of the time you're going to have to buy things.
Right.
A lot of the time. And so that's a cost which is based on individual videos. You're paying this much for this, or you get this review sample, so you have to pay the taxes on that because you're receiving it from them. There's all these variable costs which add up, whereas Creative Cloud is the fixed cost which gets spread out.
Right.
And so in the long term, a Creative Cloud subscription is basically nothing if you're regularly using it.
Especially if you're getting paid for your work.
Yes. So if it's not much of a cost in the long term, then there's also other costs, though, in terms of like lost time if you're running into things like crashes. I don't know about you, but crashes in Premiere and After Effects aren't as common as I see discussed on Twitter or YouTube. Because as much as I do a lot of stuff, I'm not dealing with rapid turnaround.
Right.
I'm not having to do one video every couple of days. And so the few times I've run into crashes have been very infrequent, very far apart, because I'm just not using it in nearly as rapidly or quickly a fashion.
Right.
A big part of Premiere Pro's reputation for crashing is most of the people who are using it are people who are big YouTubers who are releasing daily or near daily content. And just based on doing a lot, if there is going to be any issues, they're more likely to run into it.
Right. And this is a big problem that applies to many aspects of life, far outside of video editing, but that's a whole separate conversation, is not only is there the kind of the floating up of the vocal minority of people who encounter things more often, you're going to see it more, and the whole confirmation bias, rather, and all of that. But the fact that people like me who use it for multiple videos every day and pushing it to its limits are going to encounter it more than most people. And in fact, the big selling point of Adobe Premiere Pro in the first place compared to the Hollywood industry standards back when it first came out was how amazing it was that it was so stable and worked on so many configurations in the first place. And
also, a big thing is also just niche support for certain features or certain formats.
Right.
Things which, as a professional, that you definitely, absolutely, you need to have your software support, but is a big barrier in the open source space because of the costs involved in being able to have something which produces that in the first place. Adobe, with their size, is able to cater towards the professionals by supporting all these different
Right. The old Avids and Resolves and Final Cuts of the original, kind of leading up to Premiere Pro's kind of prevalence, those days, you had like one or two video formats you could edit in. You set a resolution and frame rate, that's the format of the video that you're actually editing at the start of your project. That never changes. You need all of your source files to match.
Well, to be fair, Premiere Pro with sequences, it took a while before they let you change the resolution on them.
That's true.
After having made them.
But its flexibility today is based on getting away from that older style where it was super rigid. You were locked into codecs, you were locked into preview formats, you were locked into resolutions. Premiere these days runs on any computer pretty much. That's 64-bit and running Windows 10 now, or Mac. It supports virtually any codec, any video file you can drag in
except oddly FLV.
Yeah, that's true.
Which I don't understand,
especially since their own
Adobe
Flash
Media
video
Encoder can make FLVs.
Right. Yes, that was
and that's still weird.
Weird quirks with with a couple formats. MKV support is still very young and not super stable yet. But generally speaking, you can drag in just about any codec and format, resolution, frame rate, throw it on a timeline, and make it work. And the fact that it works on so many hardware configurations, OpenCL or CUDA, be it that CUDA is better for it, but it still supports it. Integrated graphics support is now finally here. The fact that you can throw it on everything and it runs fine for the vast majority of people is honestly the reason it has a reputation of being well known and used in the first place, even if the surface level reputation is, oh, it crashes a lot. But that's what people should kind of celebrate or acknowledge. Not that we should be celebrating a corporation, but like that's the benefit. That's why so many people want to use it, because that is astounding in some degrees. Like that's really cool. Like that's the
And even a big thing is just simply support.
Right.
Because Adobe has support. And have you ever used Adobe support?
Yes, and people like me who are way too niche and advanced into the creation of the software may complain about Adobe support. But for the vast majority of users using normal stuff, they have forums, they have active social media teams, and they have one-on-one you can call in or chat in or email in, and someone will help you.
I've been through the chat once, and that was years ago, and it was honestly fine.
Right.
The person was kind enough, and they've it took me a while before I was willing to let them remote desktop in to fix a problem, but that was only because we'd went through all the steps to confirm that yes, this needs a person looking at it.
Right. Oh, I was just gonna say, I can get frustrated with support because I've got this weird random RAM issue that no one could ever diagnose that was preventing it from opening in the first place. But that's my weird configuration, and I knew that from day one. I may be able to say they didn't help my problem, but the support is there, and thousands upon thousands of users are getting actual help every day from them.
And most issues I've run into, I've been able to it might take a while, but I've eventually found a forum post or forum question about it, of which there is someone with an Adobe tag who was given an answer and it has worked.
Right. And I have tweeted enough about certain issues that I've gotten the Adobe evangelists to follow me on Twitter and follow up, and they look into it with the actual engineers. And that's not because of my social.
Didn't you have a marker bug that they saw recently?
Yeah. There was a Rush bug that I have a whole separate channel, which is why I contribute to this problem that we're talking about of people only seeing bugs. But I have my own personal channel where I kind of document bugs because it's easier to show in video form than text. But I encountered a bug with the encoding presets for Rush that also carries over to Premiere Pro because of some sort of H.264 change. And I actually had one of the design team people on the Rush project comment and be like, hey, we've noticed this. Thanks for documenting this. We'll get this fixed up. And also here's a workaround for something else. And it was just like, whoa. This channel specifically was nobody. It has 40 subscribers. That was the point, was to not leverage my social media handle just to document it. And they still show up and check it out and document it and fix it. Yeah. Unlike Microsoft.
Yeah.
I'll keep making jabs at Microsoft all day today because there's been more news about file deletion bugs, so I'm just having fun.
Oh. But speaking of Rush.
Yes, I wanted to circle back to that.
Rush is awesome.
Yes.
Rush is awesome. I won't use it. I say it's awesome, but I'm not going to use it. But here's why. Rush is the perfect compromise when it comes to people being told that they need to use Premiere, but not having people pay for stuff they don't need or resort to piracy.
Right.
And honestly, Rush, even in the professional space, has good uses, particularly for its namesake. If you're in a rush,
yeah.
A big thing I've noticed, you did your videos, all in the comments, people are like, oh, it's essentially Adobe's Windows Movie Maker. And all I can think is, surely this is more akin to iMovie.
Right.
Because it has auto ducking, which is a thing which iMovie has always had by default. And it's the whole idea of you drag and drop things in, and the things that you want people to hear get heard, and the things in the background don't. And it's all good without you having to actually care about that. That's exactly what Premiere Rush is doing, except for, not just on Mac.
Right. It has all of the high-level, well, not all the features, but all of the advanced technology already developed for Premiere Pro, but set on a kind of auto scale so that if you just need to put something together, it will make a good video for you.
but then we run into something which I sent the screenshot into your Discord, where someone in the OBS Discord actually mentioned how they thought not quite they didn't like the idea that Rush had the free export limit, so you could only do 3 exports, and then it would cut you off. I think that's a good thing. Adobe is in a situation which, unfortunately, because they're having to support all these niche formats, or they're having to provide support in a proprietary manner, they have to pay licenses.
Right.
They have to pay royalties. Like, I think, like, what, the H.264 encoder, I think, is main concept?
I feel like they use a different one, but that's at least the one that Vegas uses.
I'm pretty sure, I know Adobe did have a deal with main concept for H.264 and Flash Media Live encoder back in the day.
Right.
Oh, Flash Media.
Which also encoded to FLV.
Yeah, but it was H.264 and it used the main concept encoder. I don't know if it's still the one used in media encoder now, but it might be.
Right.
There's someone's getting paid. Yeah. Someone's getting paid. And my understanding is and if you look at any sort of H.264 licensing, if you're making software and you're selling it software, then you're paying per user.
Right.
Pretty much. Not necessarily, but pretty much you're paying the license fees on a per user basis. Most people who pick up editing software thinking that they're going to be a YouTuber, the unfortunate truth is they're not going to stick with it.
Right.
Most people don't stick around doing video work for long because they realize, oh, I actually have to edit, and editing sucks.
I have to do work. Which is made easier with something like Rush compared to Premiere Pro in the first place.
Yeah.
It doesn't suck in Rush.
The thing is, Premiere Rush, though, is essentially a fully featured trial.
Right.
That isn't based on time, but based on output. And so if you're working on something which is going to take more than 2 weeks or 30 days, then a time-based trial is awful. Because before you're even sure you're committing or you're done with something, you're having to start paying for it.
Or
Rush has
or if you're busy like me, you can download a trial and install it and then not get to it for like 15 days, and then your trial time is cut in half because it's based on install time, not active use time, and I hate that so much.
Yeah. So having it as an export limit makes it a better trial than a trial. Because it is, in effect, a trial. But it's the important thing is that most trials, like Adobe trials, if you have a trial version of Premiere Pro, it will export, but it won't let you export H.264.
Right. Because they're paying for that.
At least it didn't used to. And because the reason is, well, you're on a trial, you're not paying for it, and we have to pay licenses per user.
Right.
And so we're not going to ship this to you because otherwise we'd have to pay for it, and you're not.
Right. If you've ever bought a weird Chinese product on Amazon and it had software and you had to go through a bunch of weird steps to download the software, it's because they can't just distribute it to everyone because that's an added cost to the product. And so it's kind of a filter. It's the same kind of thing.
Rush is an Adobe product with fully featured exporting that you can trial for free, which is important because it means that you can try it out and not be held back by all the things that everyone else is telling you to use, because people will tell you, oh, if you're uploading to YouTube, export it to H.264 because it's a small file size and it's what they're going to be using anyway. I know you don't, because you use Cinelerra.
Which is such horrible logic in the first place, but side point.
Yeah, but most of the time it's because of just bandwidth.
Right. It's just the most compatible and lightweight to go with.
Yeah, so and if you're not having an H.264 option, you're going to just be like, what the heck?
Yeah, this sucks. I can't use it for the YouTubes.
Yeah, Premiere's trial has always been not worth it. This is a trial which is worth it, and I think it's smart because if you are going to be a continued user of the product and therefore be paying into Adobe's licensing costs, you're going to be exporting more than 3 times, and then you're going to start paying for it. And for people who realize, actually, this is not for me, I do not want to stick with this, or I would rather try something else because this program's not for me, they haven't spent anything on it, and they haven't resorted to piracy.
Right.
Because once they leave the software, they're no longer a user. They're no longer an ongoing user who's having to regularly pay a subscription to it. Unlike us, because we pay Creative Cloud subscriptions, and so that Creative Cloud subscription cost will include all the licenses for the encoders that are shipped with it. They're not taking up that cost, but they're also not using the software anymore.
Right.
But if you are going to use the software, you're contributing.
And even from an educational standpoint, you don't need to render out every project you use. And so if you're just learning to edit, you have, especially with the background rendering so it plays back quicker, like you can play it back without having to render it. Like you can edit unlimited time forever, so you can spend a long time learning to edit and master it over time.
And here's another awesome thing. If you're a school, for instance, like educational, like student licenses of Adobe software is actually pretty cheap.
Right.
But if you're the actual institution itself, you're paying a lot.
Yeah.
But if you want to teach people video editing or teach a media studies course and rather than providing a lot of editing stations, you can just tell people, oh yeah, get Rush.
Right.
You just don't use up your exports, only export when you're done. And then each person has their own copy of it, and then they all get to work on it, and they all get to learn the software. And then when they go out into doing video projects, or if they become freelancers or whatever, then they have to make the decision, is this worth paying for?
Right.
And they'll be going into that decision with education behind them and with experience with the software.
Right. And for my 19-year-old self that would be commenting on the video, well, actually, why would they use that in the field? I went to college for journalism. Despite the fact that the school had CS5 through CS6 provided for free, everyone was using, like, the classes told you to download Photoshop Elements or Premiere Elements and learn Premiere Elements, and that's actually what people went on to use in news stations and things like that. Like, Premiere Pro is very much pro, not prosumer, and so
Rush is pretty much a replacement for Elements.
Absolutely. And so while it may not be immediately available, Rush will still teach you how to video edit in general, and people will move to Rush as the platform. So not learning Premiere Pro immediately isn't a big deal, but Rush still has tracks. You can still show the tracks and learn most of what Premiere has to offer in that kind of editing style.
And you can send it to a regular Premiere Pro project at the end.
Which if you use up all your renders on accident...
Which is just another example of Adobe's insane inter-program compatibility.
Right.
One of the last updates, CC 2019, in the update notes, one of the sections is just increased compatibility. And one of the things I'm excited about is I can now import Animate projects directly into After Effects.
Oh, right. I remember seeing that.
And Animate has sort of been slowly dying.
Right.
Because people have been not using it, because Animate being originally Flash. The Flash platform's dying. It says if you're doing web animation, you're not exporting as Flash, you're putting it on YouTube, so it doesn't really matter the tool you're using. And then there's been less attention focused on it. But they still made a compatibility thing where I can take an Animate project and drop it straight into After Effects.
Right. And that's actually something that is going to get me into it, because I used to, growing up in the Flash era, I always wanted to learn how to do that kind of stuff, and then the turnoff of not being able to fully give it the video editing treatment has always been a thing, and I'll always find a reason to procrastinate. But in general,
because I don't think you can import Swift files directly into Premiere, but you can into After Effects.
Right.
And so I've had this weird situation where Swift to After Effects to Premiere.
Yeah.
Or you had to export it with a video using a third-party tool like Swivel is the one that most people use.
Right.
Made by the Newgrounds folks. Oh, Newgrounds. Sorry, I'm just getting very sentimental today.
Dose of nostalgia for today. But that kind of thing is going to get me into learning it. But Rush is one of those tools that if I were someone who wasn't a hermit, if I was a video professional that went out into the field and did video shooting like in a field, not a literal field, but the field, metaphorically, and had an iPad or whatever, because the iPad app is actually really cool, like I would be assembling my projects on the spot there, and then maybe taking it home to, or providing a rough cut to someone right then and there, and then taking it home to edit fully, ready to go. That saves so much time. Would have even saved me time just going and editing at like my parents' house when I shoot videos there.
I need to remember which editor program they use, but do you know the film Baby Driver?
Yes, I feel like I heard something about them using something. Is that the one that they edited on a MacBook, like on the go? Yeah.
Yeah, because the whole thing was about action sync to music
Right.
because music is a big part of it. And so they had to, in order to make sure everything fit to the music, they had to edit it on
While they were there.
while shooting.
Yeah.
And so they had this station with a MacBook on it. I'm the reason I want to look up is if they were using Premiere or if they were using Final Cut.
I think they were doing Final Cut, but I don't. But yeah, like
let me look this up. Baby Driver.
those kinds of situations are perfect for Rush. And there are even people who do quick basic edits on their phones now and send that over, and Rush can do that kind of thing, but then give you the full finalizing framework with Premiere Pro, if that's what you need.
Oh, they were using Avid.
Oh, yeah, okay.
That makes sense. See, they were editing in Avid on location.
Yeah.
And I don't know about you, but I do not like the idea of editing in Avid on location.
No, I don't like the idea of editing Avid anywhere, but that's,
Oh, I mean, Avid's all right.
I want to learn it for my professional, like, achievements, but I downloaded Media Composer first, and they hadn't added DPI scaling in, so the first few times I tried it at 4K, it was unusable because everything was so tiny, and just the whole old-school floating windows thing, which is actually a funny, like, open-source quirk, is that usually open-source apps have less user-friendly UI things just by nature, because they don't have proper UI, like, proprietary software usually have entire teams developed or dedicated to UX development.
A big part of the issue of open source, which has been improving a lot lately for some projects,
Right.
a big problem is they're made by programmers, and programmers are used to it being the case where it's like, either if this doesn't work the way I want it to, I'm going to make it so that I'm going to program it in such a way that it will work the way I want it to.
Right.
Or they're along the lines of, well, this is the proper way to get this to work. Those are the two schools oftentimes I've experienced in open source. And so you run into situations where it's just like, well, why would you expect to just be able to click on something and have it work? The proper way is to go to this menu, go create new, yada yada.
You're using it wrong.
And you can't learn it from random clicking because it's like, well, why would anyone just randomly click on it?
Right.
And then there's always the RTFM, read the manual.
And in a lot of those cases, it's not actually documented well in the first place.
Did you ever find Resolve's manual?
Oh, I did. Okay. So this applies not only to open source programs, sometimes it applies to proprietary programs. In the case of DaVinci Resolve, which is a powerful color grading tool and now becoming a video
Resolve
editor.
is great.
It edits on Linux unless you want H.264 support or a couple weird things. And until the most recent update, it couldn't support system audio. You had to have a deck link for that. But it's getting there.
Yeah.
It had a lot of quirks. It still has quirks, but it's really powerful. And if you want like the most powerful tool to start with, go for it. I was setting it up since I need it for my Blackmagic camera for the Blackmagic RAW codecs and stuff. I need to use Resolve to color grade.
Can you not import that directly into Premiere?
Not yet. They're working on support for it, but I can't even support the like Universal Cinema DNG RAW for some reason. I don't know why, but anyway, I have to use Resolve for this. And then I noticed that it has a render queue. Like you can remote render on different machines, and I got that working. I was like, whoa, that's really cool. I always wanted Adobe Media Encoder to do this. And then I noticed that in the screenshot of the manual, but it was an older version, it said you could just tell it before you opened a project or anything to just open the queue and like Adobe Media Encoder just be ready to go and you can send render jobs to it. Only none of those options were there. So I go on the forums, I'm like, hey, I'm supposed to be able to do this. I can't do this. First reply I get, as usual, it wasn't telling me to search the forums, but it was telling me the manual has everything. You need to read the manual. Go to this page of the manual. And I couldn't find it at first because Googling it only gave me like really old versions of the manual. Of course, if you go to like about help manual, it's there, but I never think to do that because you can Google everything. I found the manual, go to the exact page they want. It still has the exact same quote I quoted them. So I just copy pasted it and was like, hey, look, it still says I can do this. It took me like 2 weeks of going back and forth trying to explain what I'm trying to do to people, only for them to tell me that the manual's not actually accurate and that's got to be removed from the manual and that feature's no longer there.
See, actually, because you can do Adobe stuff has networked rendering
for After Effects, and it's not going cross-platform is a problem, and it's not great. This is you can literally.
Well, I think I think if you just use the AE render.exe, just the command line one.
Well, I was reading that
think
there's
that
like
works in
gamma shift
Wine.
issues, like the frames rendered on Mac will like have slightly different gamma than on Windows or whatever. It was really weird.
But I think that the command line one can work in Wine.
Uh-oh.
I think.
That's interesting.
I'm not sure.
Right.
I've not been able to check for myself.
Right.
But I remember briefly that rings a bell that it can work in Wine.
Right. But I thought it was this really cool feature because Resolve is insanely resource. I don't want to call it resource efficient because it literally maxes out all of your resource usage. To me, that's probably not efficient. But it can use like all of the graphics. Like you can throw in a bunch of GPUs in a computer or a bunch of processor cores. It will use it all up. And I'm like, what if you set up a render server? And I was like, okay, but you have to have a project open in order for it to render. And so
There is no command line interface.
There is, but it's headless. It's completely headless. You run the command and then you close the command prompt and you get no progress. You get no pausing and resuming. It is running in the background and you have no clue what's going on. And that's literally all the options they gave me. They were like, you can either open a project and just look at it there, or you run the headless command prompt that tells you nothing whatsoever. And I was just like, what? Just give me the UI that was there in like 2014. Give me that back.
And a big thing about Resolve is I think Resolve is cool, especially because it has link with Fusion, which is very dynamic link-esque. Oops, just hit my bottle.
It also has Fairlight, which
dynamic...
is Audition-esque. Like, it's very powerful audio tools.
Yeah, and so they work to... The Blackmagic stuff works together nicely. But, yes, it's an alternative to Adobe stuff, but we still haven't found anything which is open source. Because Resolve is proprietary as well, even if it's free, although there is the pro version.
Right. It is proprietary.
We're still talking in the proprietary space, and so like, there are alternatives which fill some of our needs from the Adobe side, but we still haven't gone into the open source space to be able to find that.
Right. Theoretically, it might get me to be able to switch operating systems to Linux, but that's still not the full switch.
Yes, you're still in the proprietary space rather than the free and open source space.
Right. And everyone tells me that if I try to use Linux like Windows, I'm just a moron, so why would I do that? Like, I realize I'm not a full-time primary computer Linux user. I'm not a programmer, which I think is important perspective for Linux usage anyway. But I have been using Linux since I was a child. I learned Red Hat 5 in place of Windows 98 for a very long time. And then I picked up Ubuntu and everything in like 2007, and I have been using it off and on. I know how to use Linux, but I also know how to use Windows, and I know how general people looking for new content on Linux want to use a computer. Using it like Windows is not a phrase that should exist other than like very specific functionality. Like I wouldn't expect to open Linux and run a registry cleaner, but you don't do that in Windows anymore anyway. But those kinds of things, like, those kinds of things irk me.
Let's be fair here, because the open source space could theoretically offer exactly what we want.
It could offer more. It could offer what I want and don't even have right now.
Yeah, and so a big problem with us advocating for why we use Adobe is people will then get the impression that we don't want to use open source, or that we think it's always inherently better than open source. I would love to switch to a full open source workflow for all the stuff, whether it's dealing with people's animation files, whether it's dealing with using GIMP instead of Photoshop, or what's the Illustrator like one? Is it Inkscape?
Krita is now or Krita or whatever is everyone keeps recommending to me, but Inkscape is another one.
Yeah, and so then and then obviously I need replacements for After Effects. I need a replacement for Premiere.
There's already good
Audition,
audio
I
tools.
guess. Audition is easy to replace.
Yeah.
Although I actually don't use Audition that often except for audio cleanup.
Right.
And so if anything can offer audio cleanup, I can easily swap out Audition, but I just wouldn't have dynamic link.
Right.
But the open source space could theoretically offer exactly what we want or need. The issue is there is technically Blender does, but it's Blender.
Yeah.
And I can't I've tried 5 times to learn Blender, and I still don't know how it works.
That should be like
even following tutorials.
That should be a fancy slogan. Just, but it's Blender, TM.
But it's Blender. But the things that an open source editor would need. First off, GPU acceleration, which Kdenlive already does to an extent.
Can be done. And multi-threading, which can be done.
Yeah. Someone could theoretically use libOBS, the backend for OBS Studio. Someone could theoretically change all the asynchronous stuff to synchronous and build an editor off of that, and you'd have all the compositional tools there. Although no one's working on that, and no one has the time.
There's going to be demand for that now that you said that.
We'll just edit that out.
Poor Jim.
No one involved in the project has the time for that,
right?
Unfortunately, but theoretically, like, there is in the open source space a compositional tool which could offer that, which could be reworked. That was more my point.
Right.
There exist GPU compositional tools which could be reworked, and then Kdenlive shows like you have all the different effects. Although you mentioned transitions are still 4x3, but if you offer all that, then what the things which are missing? Niche support for certain formats and effects types. Good video coloring tools. So being able to do masking and being able to do all these different effects or have expressions or LUTs and all those sort of things. That's like photo coloring. That's fine in the open source space.
Right.
Video coloring is a different story because you're having to do things like keyframing masks. Because if you want like an example, which if you're dealing with more on like the film side, you want to film, for instance, people in cars. You want the windows to be as clear as possible, but you need to shade that in the final edit to make it look like there's actual glass there.
Right.
What you're shooting is going to be different from what you actually want to finally deliver. And the way you do that is you do masking and you do color effects for just specific areas. Easy enough in photo, hard in video. Resolve does that very well.
Right.
But it's not open source. So and then the other thing you need, multicam.
Yes.
Multicam is vital. Because since its introduction in Premiere, I've used it quite a bit for certain projects, and it saved me a lot of time because you can do the bulk of your editing just by some mouse clicks as you watch something go by. So it takes about as long as the footage to edit a multicam thing, and then you can cut for time later.
Right.
And then the big one is just inter-program support, though. That's the big one. If someone makes dynamic link for open source, I can switch. Like, simple as that. Make dynamic link work, I could switch. I'm not saying I would,
right,
but it would actually become viable. What is stuff that you would need from an open source editor or open source software to be able to make it a viable switch? Because a big thing is the difference between alternatives and substitutes.
Right.
There's plenty of alternatives, they're not substitutes.
Right. I would need sequence nesting, and they don't have to be called sequences, but even if they're a little bit roundabout, all the big options except for Vegas support it. Vegas supports it, but you have to import an entire other project file, and it's messy. But most of the alternatives I have tried are not sequence-based. They are singular timeline. You throw everything on one giant timeline. That's not healthy editing. Generally not a way to go. Even for...
Especially being able to consolidate your efforts.
Right.
Like if you're working on multiple
layers,
individual sequences or bits of edit, you don't necessarily want them all on the same timeline because that gets messy, and you want to be able to keep things separate but still have a project file, so you're not having to make multiple project files for things. You reuse your clips between things.
Right.
Everything is consolidated but still separate.
And with After Effects or Premiere style editing, if you want to apply effects to multiple layers or tracks, you need to nest them, or else it gets really messy and out of sync very quickly.
Or you use adjustment layers, but those can cause problems with alpha and other things.
That gets messy too.
Didn't you at one point have like an issue where adjustment layers would remove the alpha from an overlay clip? That sounds familiar.
Yep. I still fight that. I have just started masking out where alpha spots are supposed to go. Like my end card, like using an adjustment layer, if I render it out with alpha, there's no alpha. If I import it into Premiere, there's no alpha. The alpha is still there in After Effects, but it's not there anywhere else. That's alpha support in general. That's not super common in some of the alternatives, oddly enough.
I absolutely would need alpha.
And that is
because I'm doing compositing work.
And that's interpreted in a few different ways based on the format that you're supporting, be it GIF images or MOV, just like QuickTime files, uncompressed AVI, actual codecs. Like it's interpreted different ways, but all of that needs accounted for. I would need well, personally, I would need like USB gadget support, like desktop things like I have here, which I don't necessarily need, but would all speed me up. Like I have this loop deck thing here that I'm trying to learn, and then there's the palette gear and all those things that don't benefit me that I would need. I would immediately start trying to switch for a platform that lets me set up every single preset and label color and everything to a keyboard shortcut, because I would no longer need auto hotkey.
Also, things like just
MIDI.
Personally, additionally onto that, I was about to say MIDI.
Yeah.
I've written a jank stream setup using a browser source and web sockets and everything to be able to use my MIDI controller to control every aspect of my stream.
Yeah.
Some of it's not working right now, but that's because of updates to OBS that I've not gone around to fixing with conflict.
Right.
But I've done that.
Right.
And it's because MIDI control is fairly ubiquitous to be able to get a controller for a specific thing you want, but making it work with a lot of software or making it work with specific software can be a pain.
Right.
I was going to say, so yeah, MIDI support would be something I'd absolutely need, mostly because it's not something I've been able to utilize fully in other software or in the software I currently use.
Right. A big thing that I personally feel like I need at this point, I don't necessarily need it, but I feel like I do, is a completely customizable UI with different workspaces. This is applicable to beyond just Adobe, but Adobe specifically uses a Chromium-based engine for their panels, and so they're all HTML.
They didn't used to.
Well, yeah, but they do now. It's nice now. Well,
although I'm not sure. Some bits can be rendered using Chromium, but I'm pretty sure some of it's still not, because I've done the Windows Inspector stuff to be able to figure out how it manages multiple OpenGL previews without crapping out.
Right.
And so it's not fully Chromium. I think it's just more that bits of it can be.
Right.
Like the libraries stuff and the integration with cloud and stock. I'm pretty sure those are definitely.
I think new features they develop, they try to use that engine. And then plugins can use it. Like you can have a plugin to integrate Google Docs, so you can have your script pulled up right as you're editing, which is really neat.
Does that exist?
Yep.
Wow.
Yeah.
I need.
There's a lot of really cool plugins that get to use that engine and integrate literally anything, since it's just a browser wrapper, into your editor, and I can spread it out as customize it to my needs with any window or panel I want across my monitors, which Resolve cannot do, and they hide stupid functions like the scaling and motion tracking of a clip, which I do in every video. I scale up or down or move it left and right. You have to click through menus to actually access that tool, and it doesn't stay up. You have to click the inspector each time. It's
very minor user experience detail, but one I rely on is the ability to put math expressions into number entries.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, if I want to half the resolution of a comp, I can just select one, write divide /2, and it will half everything.
Which Photoshop just added, which is kind of nice.
Oh, nice. That's always been a big issue of me in Photoshop, is it not doing that.
No.
And it's a minor detail, but it speeds up so many things if you can just put in a math expression. Like Adobe has a lot of those very minor user experience details that just speed up certain things.
Right.
The hotkey menu in Adobe is like something I haven't seen anywhere else, and I love it.
They've made it really good. They still don't let you access a lot of the nerdy things that I would want to, but they literally have an entire keyboard layout now that's visual and based on what you're
And
pressing.
you can drag and drop things onto it, and you can visually see what's taken up already.
Keyboard shortcuts are
changes
so important.
based on your modifiers. Yeah. It's so great.
So important. Well, the local cache and scratch, like anything you need to render or preview locally needs, like, I need to be able to use network storage and have cache generated locally, not pushed back over the network. That way I can speed that up, because even if editors don't natively support it, it would speed them up in general. Network drive support in general. Network paths are not always commonly supported when it comes to file path browsing.
Although, to be fair, that can also be a Linux issue, because Linux and Windows stuff don't like to play nice, and a lot of the times you want to set up a network share so that Windows can access it as well.
Yeah, that can get, so
a lot of that isn't necessarily the fault of the editors, but just being able to be smart about being like, okay, well, I know this is a network share, so I should behave differently.
Right. I mean, I guess not for me, but in general, having a proxy workflow would be useful for people professionally to switch, especially if they're editing like GH5 files with the 400 megabit H.264. That's not fun to edit, even on my i9. Like, that kind of file is brutal.
I think Kdenlive does have proxy clips as part of it.
And then one thing...
But that's just purely in terms of things we'd absolutely need, rather than being things that doesn't exist.
Right.
So these things can exist.
Right, yeah, this is just my wish list in general. And then the last thing is just an issue with, I mean, generally speaking, open source software on the whole is the adaptation to new formats. And this is something Premiere struggles with too, but like when new video formats come out that are used in the professional field or my camera produces, I need support for that. I shouldn't have to transcode it. And it takes...
Although, to be fair, Adobe is on the Alliance for Open Media, so AV1 support will probably be very early.
Right. That's fair. But things like ProRes RAW and the new Blackmagic RAW, you know, obviously niche things, but when new formats come out, the software needs to quickly have decode and encode support for those formats. And even on the proprietary side, that can be an issue, but obviously that's going to be sometimes far slower.
A big issue there.
Source. And it could be licensing and the codec being proprietary in the first place, but...
Or sometimes it's just a simple matter of cost. Like,
that's true.
You can't expect every open source developer to buy an Ursa Mini Pro just so they can support your camera's codec.
Right. That's true.
Although
you wouldn't need to.
That's also just an issue of companies supporting development, or because Blackmagic could, in theory, supply cameras like, oh, these people are doing open source video editing and their audience is going to want support for our stuff, we'll send that to them, or just funding in general to make working on those things worth it.
Right. I mean,
these are things which could easily be implemented with time.
Right. And in theory, like, they should just provide like some sort of SDK for the codec and sample footage, because you can just download sample footage off their site, and that being able to, like, you don't need the camera itself. Although with a lot of open source tools, like even with OBS development, like there's specific hardware configurations that someone just needs the tools to test and configure that would be supported better if someone...
There's also the issue of licensing.
Right.
Because you can have something be a publicly accessible SDK, but if it isn't GPL compliant, or you just like that, a big issue with...
I mean, I think that's the number one reason Premiere, like Adobe, has put such a hard foot down about Linux and said, do not ask about it anymore, is licensing stuff, because you can't even encode to ProRes on Windows from Adobe. So...
But a big issue is OBS discussion about this happens a fair bit. Like, NDI is GPLv free.
Mm-hmm.
OBS falls under what is called GPLv2 plus or later. So you can have the code in either GPLv2 or GPLv free.
Right.
And there are a lot of people in the open source space who don't like GPLv free. But a lot of these libraries are GPLv free, and if you incorporate them, everything becomes GPLv free.
I see.
So any copy of OBS with NDI support is necessarily GPLv free.
Interesting.
If you ship a copy of, if you want to have OBS be GPLv2 or be shippable as GPLv2, you cannot include with it NDI support because it'd be linking with library. And so a lot of these open source applications are GPLv2 and not necessarily GPLv2 plus. And so they can't even have that option of, oh, well, we'll just ship this version as GPLv free.
Right.
they have to be V2, and that means, well, we can't include NDI now because the licensing doesn't let us. And that's a whole big issue with open source in general, is just license compatibility, or the restrictions put in places,
Right.
put in place by the licenses that software choose to fall under.
And that's a big issue for the developers and for those into it. But as an end user, none of that matters.
Yes, I'm sorry. That's from a perspective of someone who's
Right.
in the development
Right.
space. Like, there are things we'd like to do that we couldn't feasibly do because of licensing or being able to be compatible.
Right.
But for an end user, it's like, well, they don't know all about that, or they don't care
Right.
about that. They just want support for a thing.
Right. Like, I could know about that, but I'm still going to want it. Like, that doesn't matter to me. I'm still going to choose what supports it. And I'm assuming
Like,
that's
a lot of people would love if OBS shipped with NDI
Right.
support in the native, like, not native, like in the
Installer.
program itself, I should say.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of people would like NDI to be in OBS itself, but it's like, well, licensing prevents that from being an easy thing.
Right. And I assume that's
Although it could theoretically be an optional thing in the installer, like
the RealSense camera.
RealSense is.
I would assume that's the same reason that a lot of open source stuff doesn't support Cineform right now, because I heard that's been open sourced and a lot of proprietary programs quickly picked it up, but most open source stuff doesn't have a clue what that is, and even VLC doesn't fully interpret it properly, so I'm guessing there's a weird license with that too. Those things are important to keep in mind, but also if I'm choosing a video editing platform, those limitations aren't going to affect my decision, and that ticks a lot of people off in the open source space, but that can't matter to me when I'm choosing a tool, like in that regard, when it's my work. When you're a hobbyist in the open source field who are just picking up tools to play with, that's different than there's a lot of perspective stuff.
So I come from the perspective of a developer who has to know all the licensing stuff and knows why this stuff can't be implemented easily.
Right.
But that doesn't matter to you.
Right. And we mentioned GPU acceleration, but that goes beyond, like, there's so many different forms. There's utilizing the iGPU or dedicated GPU for codec decoding and encoding. There's accelerated encoding. There's actual CUDA acceleration of 3D rendering stuff and breaking the ray tracing on your After Effects. And there's the new Tensor Core. There's a lot of different technologies on GPUs. There's the OpenCL stuff.
The first
CUDA cores, Tensor cores coming up that are apparently a big deal, that if an open source tool utilized it might get a lot of traction because it would speed things up so much.
A frustrating part from the perspective of a developer is most things in the open source space are licensed as GPL.
Right.
And they have a very vague definition of what a system library is. Because something is if something is GPL, it is allowed to use a proprietary system library because it's part of the system.
Right.
Which is why you can have something on Windows that talks to the Windows API and all that.
Right.
But not with a non-system library. But the definition is very vague. And so, like, DirectX and OpenGL, like, no one's going to argue that isn't system because it's provided by the GPU.
Right.
But then, like, what about CUDA?
Right.
Because CUDA is an SDK that's that you have to download and specifically code for. It's a library that just knows how to talk to a specific part of the GPU.
Right.
Is CUDA a system library? If it isn't, then technically you can't use CUDA in open source stuff.
Right.
And that's frustrating.
Oh yeah, I'm sure. And I mean, that's, yeah.
But that's back-end niche stuff.
Yeah. So despite what this video might have sounded like, our interest here is not to praise Adobe as the greatest thing in the world or defend them or anything like that. This is
definitely not the greatest.
Yeah, no.
It has problems.
And we have our own plethora of issues with it at times, and the company itself has its own issues, although, again, Adobe Rush is...
My sore spot is still that ray trace render on 10 series cards.
Never gonna let that go.
It's still a sore spot.
And although Adobe Rush is certainly a great starting point or a great mobile editing point for a lot of people to use if that's an option, but there is a lot to consider with regards to what you're choosing as a video editing platform as a working professional, and we have kind of two different field angles here with how we're approaching this, which is really what I wanted to get at when I wanted to kind of sit down and have this conversation. As as Dillon actually said, this is based on what we're actually using now, and the vast majority of people don't need the things that we need. And a lot of the workflows you get involved with are based on kind of where you start. Like if you get really enmeshed into a system, you get kind of stuck there. And so
I'm kind of stuck in the Adobe
right.
ecosystem purely because that's what I mostly started out with.
And so I've always been kind of I've been seen at least as kind of a hypocrite in terms of my recommendations, because I will recommend all day and night that you try out every open source video editing platform and try to stick with that as your primary tool, or at least one of the free options. And I think you'll be happier for it if you don't need certain things. And if you do, maybe go with Resolve. Like you could still video edit on Linux and probably be happy if you start there and you have...
Does HitFilm work on Linux? Because HitFilm is also another good option.
Right. I don't know that it does.
But if it does, even if it doesn't,
it's still...
HitFilm is another option. It has a free version, which is a good start. And you also get compositing tools, which if you're doing visual effects or you're doing any sort of that kind of thing.
Right.
Also a good option there too.
Because I'm sorry, but pirating a video editor is not a reasonable solution for anyone to do in the 99.99999% of situations. Especially if you're just starting out. You don't need it to be one of the cool kids. You can make videos on a lot of things. And you might find that a lot of the more beginner-oriented, or even some of the more simpler open source video editing alternatives actually perform better on lower-end hardware, because that's what they're designed for. That's what they're optimized for. They're not designed for the dual CPU, 4 GPU rigs that a lot of the high-end stuff can utilize. And so you might actually find that they work better on if you don't have a high-end computer in the first place, which is kind of important if you're just starting out. Yeah.
Basically, don't follow our examples.
Yeah. Do what we say,
unless you have very good reason.
unless you have a deal-breaking reason to do what we say, not what we do. Or like, and we are certainly open to...
Do as I say, not as I do.
Yeah. We are certainly open to other options. We just have a quite extensive...
I mean, I've historically told anyone, if anyone's asked me what editor should I use, I see you use Premiere, should I use that? I basically say no.
Yeah. No, that's valid. And while we both have a fairly extensive and complicated wish list for what we would want from a video editor, I don't think either of us are at all walled off against trying new ones or having options appear. And personally, I would love to switch off of Windows and get away from some of this madness, but it's just not feasible for what I specifically do at this point in time. Where can they find your stuff if they want to check out more of that sexy RGB lighting in the background and your fancy lighting?
I'm
that's
pretty
much better than mine.
I mean, it's a broken light.
Yeah.
It's a broken MIDI control. That's all it is. I mostly nowadays just do stuff on Twitch. I don't do any sort of public video stuff, so I can't really link anyone there. But if anyone does want to just hear more from me, you can check me out on Twitch at twitch.tv/DillonEA, DILLONEA.
Will be linked in the video description.
You mean you could follow me on Twitter, but that's usually just announcements for that I'm streaming on Twitch.
Why would you follow anyone on Twitter?
Why am I followed to you again?
Oh, yay!
Let me just unfollow.
Oh. And then he has made
Dang it, I can't write. Ah!
I lost one follower today. And he has made
Everyone
a couple tools
unfollow.
that I've highlighted in videos, like the PyWin context menu, which has been a lifesaver to me, and I use every day, so you can check that out too.
Some people were having crashes with that. Still need to fix,
I've probably caused you more
busy
headache with that. Yeah. I've probably pointed too many people towards you with that, but that's okay. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you to Dillon for joining me, and we may expand on this in the future. Please tell me how wonderful the open source platform is with your hate-filled comments in the description. Damn it, the comments below. Whatever. I look forward to the comments. They're going to be a good time.
a good time. Good times.
Yeah. Something like that. Words are hard.
I'll bring popcorn. I'll bring plenty of popcorn.
Plop.
Plopcorn.
Snacks.